She didn't even look up. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the ID card onto the floor. An impeccably dressed bank employee, standing safe and smug behind cold, bulletproof glass, had just discarded a black woman's identity documents as if they were a piece of trash. Then she turned away, a silent, brutal dismissal, as though the woman standing on the other side of the glass had never even existed. No explanation. No apology. Only the dry, sharp clatter of plastic hitting polished tile and the suffocating silence of countless invisible eyes judging, condemning, and choosing not to see. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt utterly terrifyingly alone? If you have hit that subscribe button right now because you know the chilling isolation I'm talking about. In that deafening stillness, something deep inside the woman began to crack. Not the pristine marble of the bank floor, but something in the very foundation of her spirit. Yet she remained perfectly still, her posture radiating a calm, proud silence that no one in that room could comprehend. Her outfit was plain, simple business wear. Her shoes were scuffed and worn. Her rich brown skin held unbowed made her at once vividly present and strangely conveniently invisible to those around her. What happened next didn't make the headlines. It didn't start a riot. But it held a force far more potent, a power born from wounded dignity and a devalued self-worth that was about to erupt in a way no one could ever predict. This is not just a story about injustice. It's a story about the quiet, devastating power of underestimation. Natalie Coleman stepped through the heavy glass doors of Stratton Financial Bank in downtown Raleigh on a blistering North Carolina afternoon. Harsh sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting a blinding glare across the gleaming marble floors. Inside, the air was cool and flawless, with soft, unobtrusive piano music playing a calculated sound designed to soothe its wealthy, important clientele. Natalie paused just inside the entrance, reflexively smoothing the lapel of her simple navy blazer and brushing back a stray strand of hair. Her attire, though modest, was impeccably neat, carefully chosen to convey a quiet professionalism. She inhaled deeply, a silent ritual to steady her nerves, and approached the main teller station. Behind the counter, a young woman with a cascade of elaborate blonde curls and a name tag reading Jessica was completely absorbed in her computer screen. Natalie waited patiently, her eyes on Jessica, expecting the simple courtesy of a polite greeting. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then an awkward, interminable stretch of time where Natalie's very presence seemed to be an unwelcome intrusion into the woman's world. Jessica didn't look up, didn't even flicker an eyelid as if Natalie were nothing more than a shadow on the wall. "Hello," Natalie said softly, finally breaking the unusual silence. The only response was an icy, impenetrable indifference. Jessica continued tapping away at her keyboard. Just then, a white man in a sharp, tailored gray suit entered, and Jessica's face instantly lit up. She offered him a warm, radiant smile, rising swiftly to greet him with an obvious, practiced enthusiasm that twisted like a knife in Natalie's gut. Natalie winced, but her feet remained rooted to the spot. She would not be dismissed. When Jessica finally glanced back at her screen, her brief, pleasant interlude over Natalie again spoke politely, her voice even and calm. "Excuse me, I'd like to make a deposit and check my account balance, please." Jessica's face clouded over with a visible frown, but she remained silent. A moment later, she slowly, reluctantly looked up and gave Natalie a dismissive, irritated glance. "Do you have an appointment?" "We only handle transactions by scheduled appointment here," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the marble counter. Natalie clenched her jaw, maintaining her composure. She explained patiently that she didn't require financial advice or a consultation. She simply wanted to deposit a check into her existing company account. Jessica let out an exaggerated, impatient sigh and pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward a row of secondary teller lanes beyond, without uttering another word. It was a clear, demeaning gesture. "You don't belong here. Go over there." Natalie nodded politely, the picture of grace under pressure, and moved to the indicated station. When it was finally her turn, she gently placed her driver's license and a certified check on the counter. Jessica approached, her eyes landing on the ID with open, unconcealed suspicion. She pinched it between her fingertips as though it were a filthy, contaminated object. She scrutinized it front and back, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent lights. Then abruptly, with a sharp, violent motion, she hurled it onto the cold stone floor, where it skidded to a stop with a harsh, echoing clatter. In an instant, all activity in the bank ceased. Every head turned toward them. A stifling, profound silence settled over the bank's grand, opulent interior. No one spoke. No one moved to intervene. Natalie's identity, her very personhood, lay discarded and devalued on the floor in full view of dozens of silent witnesses. A hot, powerful surge of anger threatened to erupt in her chest, but Natalie brutally suppressed it. Slowly, with a calm, deliberate dignity that was in itself an act of defiance, she bent down. She picked up the card, her eyes locking on Jessica's, in a silent, powerful fusion of challenge and grace. Jessica's expression remained frozen, a mask of cold indifference. There was no hint of remorse, no trace of shame. And in that heavy, pregnant silence, Natalie knew she had just stepped onto a battlefield. This was no longer just about a deposit. This was a quiet war, a battle not just for her own personal rights, but against the insidious, unspoken prejudices that surrounded her, festering in the very place where she deserved, at the bare minimum, the most basic human respect. When Natalie straightened up, the ID still clenched tightly in her hand, she realized with a jolt that the space around her had snapped back to a disturbingly normal state. The hum of conversation resumed, people turned back to their business, as if the profound act of humiliation that had just occurred was either invisible or, worse, entirely unremarkable to everyone else in the room. She drew in a deep, shuddering breath once again, smoothing the lapel of her simple jacket, and stepped back from the teller's counter. She struggled to contain the flood of raw emotions, shame, rage, and a deep, aching sorrow that were welling up inside her. Ashley, the receptionist, sat enthroned behind a sleek, modernist front desk at the far left of the sprawling lobby. Her carefully curled red hair and a pair of fashionable gold-rimmed glasses gave her an air of quiet, unassailable authority, an authority reserved only for those who are granted unspoken privilege from birth. Natalie approached her desk, a last shred of hope flickering within her. Perhaps she could get a courteous explanation, or at least a clear direction on what to do next. But Ashley, like Jessica before her, remained completely absorbed in her computer screen, her pastel pink fingernails tapping out a decisive rhythmic beat on the keyboard. Natalie stood there for 1 minute, then 2. Each passing second was a hammer blow underscoring Ashley's silent, powerful message. "Your presence here means nothing." "Excuse me, Natalie," said her voice, polite but steady, a small act of self-assertion. "Could you please tell me?" Before she could finish her sentence, Ashley raised her left hand to shoulder height in a clear, brutal, "Be quiet" gesture. Her eyes never once lifted to meet Natalie's. That single, simple motion spoke volumes. "You are an interruption. You do not matter here." A cold shiver, sharp and unpleasant, ran down Natalie's spine. She started to wonder if this was all a terrible, surreal misunderstanding. Until mere seconds later, the bank's heavy glass door swung open and a well-dressed white couple stepped inside. Immediately, Ashley looked up. Her previously frosty, impenetrable expression melted into a radiant, dazzling smile as she greeted them with an unnervingly warm enthusiasm. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Fisher. It is so wonderful to see you again," Ashley chirped, rising gracefully from her chair. "We have a 2 o'clock appointment," the gentleman said, his tone easy and courteous. "Is this the right time?" "Perfectly on schedule, sir. We are always absolutely thrilled to have you visit our branch," Ashley replied, deftly, handing them 2 sleek VIP cards. "Please head on through to the private VIP lounge and I will have someone bring you some hot tea right away." Watching this interaction unfold, Natalie felt her chest physically tighten. The blatant, galling disparity in their treatment was so painfully, insultingly obvious. She instinctively glanced down at her simple leather shoes, her unassuming office attire. There was no earthly reason for her to be so thoroughly demeaned like this. And yet in the cold, calculating eyes of Ashley and her colleague Jessica, it was clearly more than enough. A young woman in a sleek, corporate dress approached the desk next. Ashley pivoted immediately, her voice dripping with a cloying, sweet cordiality. "Hello, ma'am. How can I help you today?" Natalie just stood there, completely, utterly invisible. She could feel the other bank employees occasionally glancing in her direction, then quickly, deliberately looking away, desperate to avoid getting involved. It wasn't accidental. It was silent, cowardly complicity. Jessica's calculated coldness and Ashley's overt theatrical disdain were not isolated incidents. They were the undeniable symptoms of an unspoken, deeply rooted institutional culture, a culture where people who looked like Natalie were systemically undervalued, automatically suspected, and deliberately sidelined by a pervasive, poisonous blend of bias and favoritism. Ashley flicked a final parting look at Natalie. This time there was a faint, challenging smirk playing on her lips, as though to say, "You see, you shouldn't waste your time here." A dull, heavy ache of indignation spread through Natalie's entire body, but she refused to fall into the trap they had so clearly set for her, the trap of losing her composure, of causing a scene. She reminded herself with a force of will that felt monumental that she could not accept defeat in the face of such raw, unvarnished prejudice and injustice. Standing tall, her expression calm yet utterly resolute, Natalie made a decision. She would not leave until her rights and her dignity were unequivocally honored. She understood with a chilling clarity that this silent, lonely battle would not be easy, but she also knew deep in her bones that she would not give up. Because she was fighting not just for herself, but for every single person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, and discarded with such cruel, casual unfairness. Natalie knew that maintaining her composure in this suffocating, hostile atmosphere would be a Herculean task, but she was determined not to let Ashley's attitude or anyone else's rob her of the dignity she so rightfully deserved. Steeling herself with another deep, centering breath, she returned to the teller station once more. She was hopeful that presenting all the required paperwork would finally settle the matter. The area was noticeably quieter now. As she approached, Natalie's eyes met Jessica's, the same teller who had publicly humiliated her just minutes earlier. Jessica glanced up from her screen, her expression still radiating a cold, palpable suspicion, as if Natalie's very return were an unwelcome personal affront. Natalie laid the certified check on the counter and spoke in a measured, newly confident tone. "Here is the certified check from my business partner. I would like to deposit it into my company's account." Jessica didn't rush to reply. Instead, she leaned forward, scrutinizing the check under the harsh overhead lights. her eyes narrowing in theatrical doubt as though she were examining a piece of contraband. Without even trying to hide her skepticism, she launched into a barrage of questions completely unrelated to the deposit itself. "What's the name of your company? How long have you been running it?" Natalie answered each question with a patient, almost serene calm. But Jessica's tone grew increasingly laced with a biting, ugly sarcasm. "Where is your headquarters located? Do you have the original business registration? And by the way," she added with a smirk, "why did you choose our bank?" Her inquiries followed no recognizable banking procedure. They existed for a singular purpose: to frustrate, to delay, and to demean. Jessica's judgmental appraisal roamed from Natalie's plain, unbranded shoes to her simple blazer, her hairstyle, and the small purse clutched in her hand. Every gesture, every glance dripped with unconcealed contempt. At last, Jessica reluctantly picked up the check between her thumb and forefinger, as though it were a filthy rag. She peered at it again, holding it up to the light, and then cracked a smug, mocking half-smile. "Are you sure this is genuine?" She sneered, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It doesn't look trustworthy at all. I've seen plenty of people try to pass off phony checks that look just like this one." Natalie clenched her teeth so hard she felt a pain in her jaw, restraining the inferno of anger rising in her chest. She replied calmly, her voice a low, dangerous steel. "This is a certified check from a reputable FDIC-insured bank. You can verify it in your system." Instead of answering, Jessica leaned toward her colleague, Rachel, who had been watching the entire exchange with an expression of cool, amused detachment. Jessica murmured, loud enough for Natalie and everyone around them to hear, "What do you think of this check? Rach, looks just like the kind of fake paperwork they bring in here, doesn't it?" Rachel shot Natalie a quick, complicit glance, her lips curling in a knowing smirk of agreement. "Yeah, you can never know these days. Better be extra careful not to get fooled." Their stifled, malicious giggles, though hushed, were loud enough to carry through the quiet bank. Nearby customers cast curious, speculative glances at Natalie. A few whispered among themselves before quickly turning away, but Natalie knew the damage was done. She had already been marked with suspicion, tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. She felt as though she were standing center stage in a hostile, glaringly lit arena, every eye dissecting her every move, her every breath. Still, she refused to back down. She refused to crumble. She knew with an unshakable certainty that she had done nothing wrong. Meeting Jessica's smug, challenging gaze head-on, Natalie's voice remained preternaturally calm, but now it was unwavering, infused with a power that seemed to startle the teller. "I insist you verify this information. Thoroughly. This is a perfectly legitimate transaction, and I will not tolerate this insult." Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by Natalie's sudden firmness. Then her habitual icy mask of contempt slid back into place. With a grudging, resentful nod, she returned to her computer and began the verification process slowly, deliberately, with an obvious, infuriating reluctance. In that tense, humming silence, Natalie realized this wasn't merely a personal spat between her Jessica and Rachel. This was the raw, naked manifestation of an entrenched, unspoken culture of bias, a culture protected and enabled by the silent, cowardly complicity of everyone around her. She was up against a closed, suffocating system steeped in prejudice, and she would have to fight tenaciously, and with everything she had to secure the fair treatment and basic respect she deserved. Standing her ground, her eyes fixed like lasers on Jessica, Natalie braced herself for whatever came next. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that this was only the beginning of a bitter, exhausting struggle. A struggle she was absolutely determined to win. As Jessica continued to move with glacial, deliberate slowness through the verification process on her computer, Natalie caught sight of a middle-aged man in a dark gray, ill-fitting suit stepping out of a back office. His brow was furrowed in visible irritation, as if he had been disturbed during an important coffee break. His name tag, pinned crookedly on his lapel, read, "Thomas Kent, Branch Manager." For a fleeting moment, Natalie felt a surge of hope. Surely the manager would resolve this troublesome, deeply unprofessional situation quickly. Mr. Kent strode over his gaze, flicking over Natalie with a cool, detached disinterest, before landing on Jessica with a clear look of inquiry. "What's going on here, Jessica? Is there an issue?" Instantly, Jessica's tone softened, transforming into a model of unexpected politeness, a stark, jarring contrast to the vicious harshness she had shown Natalie. "Mr. Kent, this customer wants to deposit a rather large check. But I've noticed a few red flags, and the accompanying documentation isn't entirely clear. I thought I should get your opinion before proceeding." Mr. Kent let out an impatient sigh. He took the check from Jessica's outstretched hand, glanced at it for a few seconds, a cursory dismissive inspection, and then pronounced his verdict in a curt, decisive voice that echoed with finality. "I'm sorry, but with what we've been given, we can't process this transaction. There simply isn't enough evidence to verify its legitimacy." Each word felt like a physical blow, a blade against Natalie's self-respect. She immediately responded, her own tone, now firm and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Sir, I have provided every single document required by your bank's procedures. I truly do not understand why the bank is unable to verify such a clearly certified check." Mr. Kent arched an eyebrow, his face darkening, clearly displeased by her pushback. He looked her up and down, a slow, contemptuous appraisal, his eyes filled with an open, undisguised disdain. "The problem, madam, is that we need to ensure all transactions are conducted by qualified clients. I'm afraid you have not demonstrated that you meet our criteria." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but it was a whisper designed to be heard. "Perhaps you would be better served by another financial institution. One more, suited to your needs." Then he turned on his heel and strode back toward the sanctum of his office, giving Natalie no opportunity to reply. The sharp, decisive click of his leather shoes on the marble floor underscored his closed-minded, bigoted finality. A stifling, heavy silence fell over the lobby once more. Natalie could feel dozens of pairs of eyes assessing her, dissecting her defeat. Jessica, still standing at the teller station, seized the moment to deepen the insult, to twist the knife. She tilted her chin arrogantly and spoke loudly, ensuring that the nearby patrons could hear every venomous word. "See, the issue here isn't just about the paperwork. Honestly, looking at your clothes, your shoes, and that purse, you're not exactly the type of clientele we expect doing business at this bank." A few covert, cruel laughs rippled through the air behind Natalie. A young white woman covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glinting with a discreet, smug amusement. A man a few feet away nodded and smirked in Jessica's direction, a clear signal of agreement. The bank lobby had become a public stage, and Natalie was the unwilling, humiliated spectacle at its center. Humiliation washed over her in hot, nauseating waves. Every stare, every chuckle, every whispered comment was a small, sharp stab at her pride. But she refused to collapse. She stood tall, her gaze steady and sharp as shattered glass, even as her heart ached with a pain so profound it felt physical. Jessica's triumphant, cat-like smile betrayed her deep satisfaction at Natalie's silence. She leaned in conspiratorially to Rachel, who had watched the entire sordid affair unfold with a cold, reptilian amusement, and whispered something that made them both chuckle softly. The two women reveled in the malicious, shared delight of publicly shaming an innocent person. With a deliberate, almost surreal calm, Natalie gathered her check and papers from the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve held firm. She understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and empowering that this was no longer merely a personal affront. This was a battle for the basic dignity and fundamental respect that every single human being deserves. Before turning to leave, Natalie fixed Jessica with a clear, unhurried, and unforgettable gaze. She spoke each word with a quiet, bone-chilling strength. "Remember what you said today. There will come a time when you will have to face those words again. And when you do," she promised, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I will not be the one feeling ashamed." Then she turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Behind her, the whispers and muffled laughter continued, but they no longer mattered. As the bank doors swung open and the brilliant, unforgiving sunlight of the afternoon flooded in, Natalie felt only a cold, searing brightness, an echo of the raw, brutal discrimination she had just endured. Stepping out into the heat of the day, she knew she had just experienced a profound, soul-deep humiliation. But she also knew with every fiber of her being that she would be back. And the next time she walked through those doors, she would not remain silent. Stepping out of the bank doors, Natalie felt that the scorching North Carolina sunshine wasn't nearly warm enough to melt the bone-deep chill that had settled in her heart. The heavy glass doors clicking shut behind her felt like a definitive full stop, an end to the superhuman patience she'd managed to hold on to until now. But in that moment of despair, standing on the hot pavement, she had a revelation. Silence in the face of prejudice was a form of acceptance. Passive endurance in the face of injustice was a form of defeat. The deep psychic wound she'd just suffered would never fade if she simply walked away and quietly absorbed it. It would fester. Back at her own office, Natalie closed the door firmly behind her. The familiar scent of leather and paper was a comfort. She sank into her worn, familiar executive chair and stared down at the neatly arranged file lying open on her desk. It was the contract. It contained the meticulous, ironclad details of the $2.3 billion construction agreement her company Coleman Construction had just signed with Stratton Financial itself. Her gaze lingered on the signature line at the bottom, a bold, confident flourish of ink. Natalie Coleman, Chief Executive Officer. She knew exactly who she was. She knew exactly what her true worth was. And she would be damned if she let anyone treat her with the contempt she had just been forced to endure. That night, Natalie barely slept. She sat at her mahogany desk through the silent, early hours of the morning, assembling a new file. A war chest. Every piece of relevant documentation, the signed contract, detailed company financial portfolios, even a direct letter of confirmation and partnership from Stratton Financial's own board of directors. Each crisp black and white page reaffirmed one undeniable explosive fact. She was the CEO of one of the leading construction firms in the state and a critical strategic partner to the very bank that had just thrown her ID on the floor. Natalie understood with perfect clarity that her return would be a formidable, earth-shaking confrontation. But this time, she wouldn't be begging for service. She would be demanding the respect and the justice she deserved. The next morning, Natalie strode back into Stratton Financial. This time, there was no navy blazer. She'd chosen a sharply tailored black power suit, meticulously polished high heels that clicked with authority on the marble, and a sleek, severe updo. It was an undeniable uniform of executive power. As she pushed open the glass doors and walked straight inside, those who had smirked and whispered at her the day before shot her curious, surprised glances. Ignoring their stares, Natalie went directly to the reception desk, where Ashley was once again presiding over her domain. Ashley looked up, her face registering a momentary flash of surprise, but she quickly slipped back into her cool, indifferent mask. This time, Natalie didn't wait to be dismissed. She spoke in a calm, commanding voice that was impossible to ignore. "I would like to see the branch manager, Mr. Thomas Kent, right now." Ashley hesitated, visibly flustered by Natalie's new resolute tone. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Kent is very busy at the moment." "I am certain he will want to meet with me," Natalie interrupted, placing a heavy cream-colored business card on the desk. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "Please hand this to him immediately. I trust he will understand the importance of this matter." Reluctantly, as if being forced to touch something distasteful, Ashley picked up the card. Her eyes glanced down at it, and her entire demeanor shifted. The color drained from her face. Her expression went from aloof condescension to wide-eyed, dawning astonishment as she read the simple, elegant text, "Natalie Coleman, CEO, Coleman Construction Group." Without meeting Natalie's eyes, her face a mask of sudden, frantic panic, Ashley hurried off toward the manager's office. Moments later, the door to that office burst open and Thomas Kent emerged, his expression a chaotic, bewildered mix of confusion and alarm. "Ms. Coleman, I never expected," he stammered, his eyes wide with a terrifying disbelief. "I'm sure you would rather hear this in person," Natalie replied, her voice crisp, cool, and utterly authoritative. With no choice, a visibly sweating Kent led her inside his private office and quickly closed the door. Natalie walked to his expansive desk and placed the thick stack of documents, the contracts, the confirmations, the board credentials, squarely in front of him. Kent began to flip through them, his hands trembling, growing visibly horrifyingly pale, as he recognized not only her true identity, but the absolutely crucial multi-billion-dollar role she played in his bank's immediate financial future. "Ms. Coleman, I don't know what to say," he finally whispered, his voice trembling so hard the words were barely audible. Natalie held his gaze, her own eyes like chips of flint. "I'm not here for your apologies, Mr. Kent. I am here so that you understand this. The treatment I received in your branch yesterday was not just unprofessional. It was unacceptable. Your bank has humiliated a key strategic partner, and there will be serious, profound consequences unless you and your team acknowledge your wrongdoing." Kent sank heavily into his chair, his eyes fixed on the damning documents on his desk, his face a sickly shade of gray. In that charged, humming silence, Natalie knew her words had landed with the force of a wrecking ball. As she rose to leave, Natalie paused at the door. She turned back and spoke with a crystal-clear, unforgettable conviction. "Mr. Kent, I am leaving today not as a humiliated customer, but as a partner granting your bank one final fleeting chance to make this right. I trust you are wise enough to understand what comes next." With that, the door closed softly, but with earth-shattering finality behind her. Walking away, her heels clicking a steady, powerful rhythm on the marble floor, Natalie felt she had regained far more than just her dignity. She had forced the very people who had scorned her to confront the ugly, rotting prejudice they had so carelessly, so callously assumed was acceptable. She needed nothing more to know that she had ignited a firestorm. And this was just the beginning. Okay, let's take a breath. What an incredible turnaround. If you're loving this story of poetic justice, smash that like button, and let me know in the comments, what do you think should happen to the bank employees? Drop your thoughts below. The branch manager's office door closed behind her as Natalie walked away, head held high, though a dull fire of disappointment and righteous anger still smoldered in her chest. She knew, however, that to truly set things right, to excise the poison from the root, she needed to see someone with real institutional power. Someone who would understand not just the insult, but the full catastrophic value of the contract and the severe brand-destroying fallout if their partnership were to be damaged. One name immediately came to mind: Michael Andrews, the regional vice president of Stratton Financial. That very afternoon, Natalie's assistant secured an urgent appointment with Mr. Andrews' office, stressing in no uncertain terms that the matter was business critical and directly tied to the bank's new $2.3 billion construction deal. Less than 30 minutes later, the meeting was confirmed. Andrews' office occupied the entire top floor of the bank's towering headquarters. Its walls were adorned with expensive, minimalist abstract art, and its floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a sweeping, commanding view of downtown Raleigh. Natalie entered with a quiet confidence, making no grand gestures, just letting her poised presence and professional attire draw Andrews' immediate, undivided attention as he sat at the head of a massive, polished conference table. "Good afternoon, Ms. Coleman. I understand you have an urgent matter to discuss." Andrews greeted her, his tone polite, but clearly edged with a wary curiosity. Wasting no time on pleasantries, Natalie opened her sleek leather briefcase, withdrew the meticulously prepared dossier, and placed it firmly on the table before him. "Mr. Andrews, I believe you need to review this contract again. It directly involves my company Coleman Construction Group, the sole strategic partner on your bank's new $2.3 billion project." Andrews raised a skeptical eyebrow. His expression shifted from reserved to intrigued as he took the file, carefully flipping through each page. His eyes at first scanning, then widened in disbelief. His hand, Natalie noted, trembled ever so slightly when he reached the final signature page. There it was in bold, unmistakable ink: Natalie Coleman, Chief Executive Officer, directly beneath his own sweeping signature as the bank's official representative. For a long, agonizing heartbeat, the entire room fell into a suffocating, soundless vacuum. Andrews looked up at Natalie, his face completely drained of color, as the full, terrifying gravity of his staff's misconduct finally registered in his mind. "Ms. Coleman, I can't believe this. Is this real?" he finally whispered, his voice wavering, laced with a horrified disbelief. Natalie met his panicked gaze steadily, her own expression unreadable. "Mr. Andrews, I never imagined I would have to stand here and reaffirm a fact that your own bank should have recognized from the very start: Stratton Financial. Your institution treated me like I didn't belong, like I was a fraud, despite the fact that I personally signed a legally binding agreement that represents billions of dollars in profit for you." Andrews sank back heavily in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes tracing the contract's printed lines, as though desperately seeking some loophole, some excuse in the fine print, yet finding none. He knew better than anyone the catastrophic fallout such an error could trigger for the bank. Not just the immediate financial loss, but the long-lasting reputation-shattering stain on Stratton Financial's carefully curated image. I honestly don't know how to excuse my team's behavior." Andrews admitted the raw tension cutting through his carefully chosen words. "Please, you must understand I had no idea this was happening." Natalie's lips curved into a slight knowing and devastatingly calm shake of her head. Her eyes were sharp, yet not without a flicker of empathy for the man unraveling before her. "Mr. Andrews, the issue isn't just about ignorance. It's about the culture. It's about the pervasive mindset within your bank, a toxic environment where this kind of casual bias and systemic discrimination are silently tolerated and allowed to fester." Andrews had no response. The funereal hush in the glass-walled room magnified the quiet, insistent ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick seemed to serve as a stark, mocking reminder of his own powerlessness in the face of Natalie's pinpoint, irrefutable indictment. Finally, she rose from her chair and straightened her blazer with a deliberate, unhurried calm. "I am not here to threaten your bank, Mr. Andrews. I am here to give you and your institution one chance to correct this injustice before it is beyond repair. But please know this, unless there is a fundamental top-to-bottom shift in attitude and culture here, Stratton Financial will lose far more than just this one crucial contract." For the first time since she had entered the room, Andrews looked up at her with an expression of genuine, unadulterated respect. "Ms. Coleman, I will see to it that this is resolved. Immediately. And thoroughly. You have my word." Natalie gave him a single sharp nod, turned on her heel, and left the room. Her departure left Andrews alone to confront the full, crushing weight of her words. As the heavy office door clicked shut behind her, she knew she had forced him to face the painful, ugly truth that he and his entire institution had for too long conveniently ignored. As she strode down the long, silent corridor, Natalie felt her own strength, her own unassailable worth, more clearly and powerfully than ever before. She understood with a profound certainty that this battle was far from over. But she would no longer stay silent, and that she knew was the first critical step toward real, lasting change. The moment Natalie closed Michael Andrews' office door behind her, an undercurrent of raw, palpable tension began to spread like an electrical charge through every corner of Stratton Financial. Curious, fearful glances and murmured, frantic whispers multiplied by the minute, turning the normally quiet, hallowed hallways into buzzing zones of deep, anxious unease. No one knew exactly what had transpired behind those closed doors, but the hollow, ashen look on the regional vice president's face as he emerged was all the confirmation they needed. Something catastrophic had happened. Less than an hour later, senior leadership ordered an immediate top-down internal investigation. Every single transaction record, every frame of security camera footage, and every internal phone call log from the Raleigh branch was meticulously scrutinized. All staff members even remotely involved in the incident were summoned to the head office to explain their actions at once. Jessica, the once confident, sneering teller who had so brazenly insulted Natalie, now sat trembling before the bank's stern-faced leadership committee, her former arrogance completely stripped away. She stumbled through a series of feeble, contradictory excuses, but when the high-definition surveillance footage played on the large screen, showing in undeniable, crystal-clear detail her contemptuously dropping Natalie's ID on the floor, any remaining pretense of innocence evaporated. She was visibly shaken, her face white with terror, completely unable to defend herself against such damning, irrefutable evidence. Rachel, Jessica's close colleague and partner in mockery, initially tried to deny any wrongdoing. But when audio recordings of her own hateful, derogatory comments were replayed, her face went pale, and she fell into a stony, terrified silence. Remarks she had dismissed as harmless private banter now stood as ironclad proof of a deep-seated toxic bias within the bank, something she had never ever imagined would be so ruthlessly exposed. Yet the most serious and damning case was that of the branch manager, Thomas Kent. He sat tense and exhausted in a leather chair that felt miles too big, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. Testimony from other employees and hours of video evidence laid bare not just his apathy, but his active failure to intervene when his own employees openly discriminated against a customer. The leadership committee confronted him with a single devastating question he couldn't possibly answer. As the manager of that branch, how could you possibly allow such blatant, disgusting discrimination to occur under your watch? He bowed his head, cold sweat beading on his forehead fully, and finally aware that his entire career was about to be destroyed in an instant by his own negligence and complicity. Meanwhile, at the front reception desk, Ashley was facing her own internal storm of outrage. As the first employee to interact with Natalie, and the one who showed the most blatant theatrical contempt she found, she had no defense for her cold, dismissive demeanor once the surveillance footage and multiple eyewitness statements came to light. Under immense, unbearable pressure, she submitted her resignation within 2 days and quietly, ignominiously left the bank, unable to endure the shame and the fallout. Stratton Financial's leadership responded swiftly and without a shred of mercy. For the first time in the bank's long and storied history, a special internal bulletin was issued to every single employee across the country. It declared a new ironclad zero-tolerance policy for any form of prejudice or discrimination, however minor. Every line of that public announcement served as a stern, chilling warning to anyone at any level harboring bias or disdain. That evening, Michael Andrews convened an urgent mandatory all-staff meeting in the main auditorium. Standing before a silent, terrified room, his voice grave and powerfully authoritative, he declared that the recent events were utterly, unforgivably unacceptable. He stated in no uncertain terms that the bank would not tolerate anyone intentionally or not insulting a customer, especially a key strategic partner like Natalie Coleman. "We have made a grievous, unforgivable mistake," Andrews emphasized, his piercing eyes sweeping the cavernous room. "From this moment forward, I want each and every one of you to reflect deeply. Have you even in the smallest way ever exhibited similar attitudes? If so, change. Change immediately before it is too late for you." When the meeting ended, the very atmosphere at Stratton Financial had irrevocably, fundamentally shifted. Employees filed out of the auditorium with bowed heads and heavy, fearful thoughts, each one now keenly, terrifyingly aware that seemingly small, thoughtless, and prejudiced actions can carry absolutely devastating consequences. As Michael Andrews walked through the now quiet, empty corridors, he recognized that the bank had just endured its most painful lesson. But he also knew with a certainty he couldn't explain that it was a necessary turning point, a brutal but essential catalyst to ensure that Stratton Financial would never ever repeat such a grave and shameful error. Immediately after the emergency meeting concluded, the atmosphere at Stratton Financial shifted from tense to one of almost suffocating gravity. Michael Andrews, the regional vice president, realized with a heavy heart that this crisis wasn't merely the fault of a few bad apples. It was the clearest, most undeniable sign yet of a toxic corporate culture, a rot that had for far too long gone unchecked. In the quiet of his private office, surrounded by the panoramic views of the city, Michael sat in silence, reviewing the freshly completed, brutally honest internal investigation reports. The documented incidents of racial bias, casual customer contempt, and deeply ingrained discriminatory attitudes were not isolated mistakes. They were the festering symptoms of a system lacking rigorous oversight and a moral compass. He understood all too well that without deep, sweeping, and immediate reforms, the bank would inevitably face even graver consequences down the line. Within days, an official notice, a declaration of a new era, went out to every single branch across the country. Stratton Financial would not tolerate any form of prejudice or discrimination, and a far stricter, more vigilant internal control process would take effect immediately. The first painful step was to suspend, and in some cases terminate the employment of the staff members who were either directly involved or passively complicit in the recent events. Jessica, whose vile actions were so clearly and damningly captured on security footage, was dismissed on the spot. She left the bank in a shroud of silence, her former sneering arrogance completely replaced by a hollow, profound shame and a dawning, terrible regret. Rachel, who had so gleefully egged Jessica on with her own derogatory racist remarks, was placed on indefinite unpaid suspension and was required to attend a series of in-depth diversity and anti-racism training sessions. She sat stunned and disbelieving in a closed-door meeting room as a panel of senior leaders delivered stern, unforgiving lectures. For the very first time, she was forced to realize that her casual, cruel laughter at another person's pain was no mere slip of decorum, but a serious career-ending offense. Perhaps the most drastic and public action fell upon Thomas Kent, the once powerful branch manager. After a tense and thorough board review, he was unceremoniously demoted and reassigned to a low-level administrative support role, completely stripped of the authority he had once so carelessly wielded. In his new cramped, windowless office, he would stare at his own trembling hands fully, and finally aware that his entire career, everything he had worked for, had been utterly and irrevocably derailed by his own cowardly silence and willful indifference. Meanwhile, Ashley, the receptionist who had shown Natalie the most blatant and theatrical contempt, had already resigned under the crushing weight of the internal outrage. Her abrupt, unceremonious departure served as a stark, chilling warning to all remaining staff. No one would be allowed to enable or ignore discrimination, even in its smallest, most casual form. With the necessary personnel actions completed, Stratton Financial launched a mandatory company-wide diversity and anti-discrimination training program across the entire organization. From intensive multi-day seminars and immersive workshops to urgent soul-searching roundtable discussions, every single employee, from the highest senior executives down to the newest hires, was required to participate. Leading national experts on diversity, equity, and inclusion were brought in to teach the staff how to recognize their own unconscious biases, how to practice respectful, empathetic interactions, and how to appreciate the paramount bottom-line importance of equity in every single client encounter. At the very same time, the bank completely restructured its internal controls. A new, powerful oversight division was established, reporting directly to the highest levels of senior leadership. It was tasked with independently monitoring customer fairness, flagging any suspicious transactions or reports of discriminatory behavior, and ensuring they were immediately addressed and resolved. Michael Andrews personally oversaw the launch of these critical initiatives, stressing in every single meeting that culture and attitudes don't change overnight. But by starting today, right now, we can ensure that this painful, shameful mistake can never, ever be repeated. Within a week, the public face of Stratton Financial had tangibly transformed. Forced guest service smiles and averted guilty eyes were replaced by a new, focused professionalism and a heightened, almost nervous vigilance. Employees began to engage with clients more sincerely, more carefully, as if every single transaction, every single interaction was being personally watched by the bank's highest leadership. Back in his private office, surrounded by the architectural plans for the new reforms, Michael reviewed the reorganization files with a profound sense of relief. But he knew this was only the very beginning. Those forceful reactive changes had laid the necessary groundwork, but rebuilding true trust and rehabilitating the bank's tarnished reputation would take a long, sustained, and unwavering effort. Above all, the bank needed to cultivate a new, deeply rooted environment where every single customer, regardless of who they were, what they wore, or how they looked, felt genuinely, truly respected and valued. As he left the office much later that day, walking down the brightly lit, now quiet corridors, Michael felt a rare sense of peace, intricately interwoven with a fragile hope. It was a hope that Stratton Financial's most painful, most shameful lesson would become the very catalyst that would propel it toward a stronger, fairer, and ultimately more human future. The sweeping seismic changes at Stratton Financial didn't just shake the bank's internal ranks. They also triggered a series of unexpected, profound transformations in the personal lives of those who had been at the very heart of the scandal. Once the imposing bank doors closed behind them for the last time, Jessica Rachel and Thomas Kent found themselves forced to reckon with the devastating consequences of behaviors and assumptions they had for their entire lives taken for granted. Jessica's reckoning. Jessica, who had once stood behind the teller window with an icy, unshakable self-assurance, now found herself wandering the busy streets of Raleigh in a daze, her former confidence and sneering arrogance completely shattered. After being fired, she faced a long, humbling stretch of unemployment, and it was during that lonely, desperate time that the true human impact of her discriminatory actions finally hit her with the force of a physical blow. One morning, she stumbled across a volunteer notice from the Equal Access Foundation, a local nonprofit dedicated to helping minority communities obtain fair, unbiased financial services. On a sudden, desperate impulse, she signed up initially just to assuage the gnawing guilt that kept her awake at night. But the more she worked alongside people who had experienced the exact same casual contempt she had once so freely dished out, the more she began to grasp how deeply her cold, calculated indifference had truly hurt them. Before long, Jessica became one of the Foundation's most devoted volunteers. She spent most of her days patiently guiding elderly and first-generation residents through the complexities of creating budgeting plans, opening their first bank accounts, and applying for small business loans on an equal footing. One afternoon, she sat beside an elderly African-American woman who was trembling at a bank entrance, terrified that she would be turned away and humiliated just for asking. Watching the woman's palpable fear, a mirror of the pain she herself had inflicted, Jessica's eyes filled with hot, shameful tears. She finally truly felt the full, crushing weight of the suffering her thoughtless attitude had caused. Rachel's confession and growth. Rachel, Jessica's former colleague and co-conspirator in mocking Natalie, underwent a similarly profound, though different, transformation. She took a brave, terrifying step and posted an open letter on her social media publicly admitting her wrongdoing without reservation. In that letter, she expressed a deep, agonizing shame and a profound remorse for failing to recognize just how damaging and cruel her discriminatory remarks had been. Her raw, honest apology spread quickly through local online communities, earning a surprising wave of praise and even forgiveness from many, especially from those who had faced the same kind of casual, everyday prejudice. But she didn't stop there. Rachel enrolled in an intensive corporate diversity and anti-racism program. In every single session, she took meticulous notes and asked sharp, insightful questions, desperate to truly understand the nature of unconscious bias. Late nights spent poring over research materials and historical texts revealed to her how deeply prejudice can lurk in the smallest, most seemingly harmless actions, and yet still wound people to their very soul. Rachel emerged from that training a changed woman determined to become a fierce advocate against the very biases she had once so casually and cruelly ignored. She viewed it as her lifelong responsibility to make amends. Thomas Kent's redemption. Thomas Kent, the once powerful, complacent branch manager found himself under a prolonged, grueling, and humiliating internal investigation. The evidence of his gross negligence and tacit, cowardly complicity grew too strong for even him to deny. After weeks of intense stress and painful solitary reflection, he was stripped of his managerial title and unceremoniously reassigned to a low-level administrative support role, losing all the authority and prestige he had once so proudly wielded. Yet in those darkest, most humbling days, Thomas realized that losing his professional prestige hurt far less than losing his own self-respect. He voluntarily joined the Community Business Initiative, a small, underfunded organization dedicated to supporting minority-owned small businesses. For the first time in his long, insulated career, he came face to face with the very invisible systemic obstacles he had once so callously overlooked. Each day, as he counseled ambitious, talented young entrepreneurs of color on how to secure the loans and expand their markets, Thomas began to understand firsthand the soul-crushing invisible barriers they faced every single day simply because of their backgrounds. One late afternoon, while sitting with a brilliant young black man who had been repeatedly and inexplicably denied credit, Thomas remembered Natalie Coleman's quiet resilience and the profound pain he had seen in her eyes. He finally grasped the deep helplessness and the searing insult his own lazy, privileged apathy had inflicted upon her. In the quiet of his modest, shared office space, Thomas vowed to spend the rest of his career tirelessly helping those who had once been so unfairly marginalized. It became his personal path not just to atone for his past failures, but to rediscover the true, forgotten purpose of his work and his life. A journey from wrong to right. Jessica, Rachel, and Thomas each embarked on their own painful yet ultimately hopeful journeys of transformation. They learned through humbling real-world experience that true redemption isn't just a matter of saying you're sorry. It requires concrete, sustained, and heartfelt action to heal the wounds that you have caused. And from their most serious, most shameful missteps, all three found a new, truer calling, one that allowed them to not only change their own lives for the better, but to help build a fairer, more just, and more humane society. While those who had harmed her were just beginning their long, arduous journeys of atonement, Natalie Coleman quietly stepped into an entirely new chapter of her own. She did so not through public retaliation or by seeking glory from the headline-grabbing scandal, but by pouring every ounce of her considerable energy and resources into a far more meaningful, far more powerful mission. In the days immediately following the incident, Natalie's office was flooded with dozens of calls from reporters, bloggers, and local media outlets, all eager to exploit the juicy headline-grabbing story of a powerful black woman CEO being mistreated in a downtown Raleigh bank. But Natalie politely and firmly declined every single interview. She knew with a deep, intuitive wisdom that simply retelling the story of her own suffering wouldn't uproot the entrenched systemic biases at play. To do that, she needed to turn from words to concrete transformative action. Instead of speaking to the press, she set to work building a passion project, something she'd dreamed of for years. She called it Empower the Future, an intensive free training program in financial literacy, business management, and capital access tailored specifically for women and young entrepreneurs of color in the Raleigh area. The program's aim went far beyond imparting basic business skills. Natalie wanted to equip her participants with the unshakable confidence and the deep, resilient spirit needed to shatter the invisible, insidious barriers they faced every single day. The early rollout wasn't without its challenges. There was skepticism. There was a lack of funding. Yet Natalie refused to back down. She personally led each session, sharing candid, vulnerable stories from her own long experience of being turned away, being dismissed, being doubted. She did this to show her students that these painful obstacles weren't unique to them, and that how they chose to respond was the most crucial factor in their ultimate success. Word of her program spread like wildfire. Within weeks, determined, bright-eyed young people from across the region began to flock to her classes. Many of them had grown deeply discouraged after being repeatedly denied loans because of their names or their skin color. Others had been consistently demoralizingly underestimated at work simply because of their gender or their appearance. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional class session had ended, a 23-year-old student named Keisha waited patiently until all the chairs were stacked and the room was empty. Strong and poised, Keisha's usually steady, confident gaze now shimmered with unshed tears as she approached Natalie. "Miss Coleman," she said, her voice catching with emotion, Today was the first time I walked into a bank feeling truly confident. Not because I was sure they'd approve my business loan, but because for the first time I finally truly understood my own worth. I want you to know, this program has completely changed my life." Natalie felt a lump form in her throat. In that powerful, simple moment, she realized that her decision to teach, to share her strength, went far beyond just sharing knowledge. It was about giving these young, brilliant people the profound, unshakable conviction that they were fully, unequivocally deserving of every single opportunity they chose to pursue. Before long, Empower the Future expanded its reach, launching new cohorts in other underserved neighborhoods across the city. Local news outlets began featuring heartwarming stories of young, determined entrepreneurs who, for the very first time, had secured the financing to launch their dream businesses. They reported on new emerging women leaders of color who were finding their footing and excelling in major local firms. Community and civic leaders began to take notice. But rather than leverage this growing attention for personal acclaim or fame, Natalie funneled every single resource, every donation, every offer of help back into providing more free classes, creating new startup grants, and building a powerful mentorship network so that the program's alumni could continue to support one another. At the program's first official graduation ceremony, Natalie stood on a modest stage before hundreds of proud, determined faces. Her voice, when she spoke, rang out clear and strong through the packed community hall. "I once believed that silence was the best response to injustice," she began. "But today, looking out at all of you, at your strength, at your brilliance, I understand that our most powerful, most definitive reply to bias and discrimination isn't vengeance. It is each and every one of us achieving our own success with courage, with grace, and with absolute conviction." Her words echoed through the hall, landing with profound weight. As she spoke, Natalie spotted a familiar figure standing quietly at the very back of the room, Thomas Kent. In his hand, he held a small folder from his new job at the Community Business Initiative, and his eyes were fixed on Natalie with a complex, moving mixture of deep gratitude and profound remorse. He gave her a single gentle nod, an unspoken thank you for the incredible life-altering change she had sparked. Not just in the community, but deep within him. The ceremony ended, but its ripple effect, its quiet power, only continued to grow. Natalie walked slowly through the bustling hallway, her heart brimming with a joy so profound it was almost overwhelming. She felt an unwavering belief that she was on the right path. She had not only healed her own deep wounds, but she had become a powerful, unassuming catalyst for healing in countless others. That night, as the city lights of Raleigh dimmed, Natalie sat quietly by her office window, gazing out at the familiar skyline. She knew that this story was no longer just hers. It had become the spark that had given so many talented young people from marginalized communities a voice, a sense of belonging, and a tangible place in society. And in that powerful realization, she found the greatest, most meaningful victory she could ever have wished for. Natalie's steadfast, quiet efforts gradually created a far-reaching, transformative impact that went beyond anything she had originally anticipated. Not only did determined young people from underserved communities take notice, but even the very organizations that had once stood on the opposite side of her painful story began to recognize the powerful positive changes she was bringing about in their city. One morning, while seated in the modest, busy office of Empower the Future, Natalie received a crisp, official-looking envelope from the Raleigh Business Association. She was startled to see the familiar, elegant logo of Stratton Financial printed on the letterhead. After a moment's hesitation, her heart beating a little faster, she opened the envelope and quickly read its contents. It was a formal invitation for Natalie to serve as the keynote speaker at the city's prestigious annual conference for entrepreneurs and top business leaders. At the bottom of the letter, in a familiar sweeping hand, was the signature of Michael Andrews, the same Michael Andrews who had witnessed and so decisively addressed the bank's deeply discriminatory incident. What surprised Natalie wasn't the honor of the invitation itself, but the profound, almost tectonic shift in perception it represented from the very institution that had once so deeply harmed her. Despite a brief initial reluctance to step into such a public spotlight, Natalie decided to accept. She understood with a clarity born of experience that this would be more than just a speech to a faceless crowd. It was a crucial, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to amplify her message of equality, trust, and mutual respect on the largest possible stage. On the day of the conference, the grand ballroom of the Raleigh Center Hotel brimmed with the city's most influential entrepreneurs and top executives from companies both big and small. The soft, warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers reflected off their polished attire, creating an atmosphere of quiet elegance and palpable tension. Amid the powerful crowd, Natalie easily spotted Michael Andrews seated in the front row, his eyes filled with a clear respect and an open, honest expectation. Seated next to him were Thomas Kent and Jessica, their faces a complex, uneasy mix of anticipation, shame, and a dawning, difficult-to-process regret as they recalled the events of the past. The MC stepped to the podium, and his voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker today, Ms. Natalie Coleman, the esteemed CEO of Coleman Construction Group and the visionary founder of the Empower the Future program." The audience erupted in warm, sustained applause as Natalie took the stage, her expression calm and radiate with a quiet, powerful confidence. For a brief, charged moment, her gaze swept over the very people who had once so carelessly belittled her, yet there was not a single trace of blame or accusation in her eyes. She knew with every fiber of her being that she was not here to revisit painful memories, but to gently yet firmly guide everyone in that room toward a better, different, more human future. Adjusting the microphone, Natalie paused for a few seconds, letting the entire room fall into a complete, expectant silence before she began to speak, her voice clear, resonant, and utterly captivating. "Today," she began, "I will not speak about myself, nor will I recount the specific events of the past. Instead, I invite each and every one of us to consider a simple question. A question that has the power to fundamentally transform the way we see and the way we treat one another. All eyes in the room turned to her expectant, intrigued. She smiled gently, then asked her question deliberately, powerfully, and with a grace that held the entire room in its thrall. How would our world change if we simply trusted one another from the very first moment we learned who someone truly is? An unusual, profound hush fell across the entire room. It was a question so simple, yet so deeply profound, that it seemed to reach into the very core of every single person seated there. In the front row, Michael Andrews bowed his head, his eyes closing in a moment of deep, reflective thought as he recalled the grave, costly mistake of not trusting Natalie upon their very first meeting. Thomas Kent sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The memory of the doubt and disdain he had once directed at her, now a source of deep, abiding pain. And at the back of the room, Jessica quietly wiped away a tear, realizing with a sudden searing clarity that had she simply trusted Natalie from the start, she might never have lost her job, her pride, and her self-respect so bitterly. All across the room, others felt a similar uncomfortable pang of conscience, silently questioning whether they too had ever acted in the same dismissive, judgmental way. Natalie said nothing further. She simply stood there in the warm glow of the spotlight, allowing the immense, transformative weight of her question to sink deeply into every soul present. After a full pregnant minute, the first gentle, tentative applause broke the silence. And then it spread like a wildfire, a rushing wave of sound filling the entire ballroom with an unequivocal, emotional, and powerful show of support for her message. As she stepped down from the stage, Michael Andrews rose and approached her, his eyes more sincere and more humbled than Natalie had ever seen them. "Thank you, Natalie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you said today? It not only helped me understand you better, but it helped me understand myself and the bank that I represent." Natalie nodded warmly, her gaze kind, yet utterly resolute. "We all have the capacity to change, Mr. Andrews. The real question is, do we have the courage to begin? And that courage starts with trusting each other's inherent worth and character." Andrews remained silent, nodding deeply, fully aware that this was the single greatest, most important lesson of his entire managerial career. As Natalie walked down the long, carpeted corridor, away from the applause and the accolades, she felt more at peace with herself and with the world than she ever had before. That day, Raleigh's powerful business community had witnessed not just the brilliance of a resilient female CEO, but to an even greater extent, they had been forced to examine their own consciences and to begin the difficult, necessary work of fundamentally shifting how they perceived and treated others. And Natalie, once a wounded, silent victim of prejudice, had ascended to the highest, most meaningful level of recognition, not through anger or retribution, but through a single powerful and life-altering question, a question capable of changing the very world she lived in. When she finally stepped out of the grand hotel hall, Natalie knew her story no longer belonged to her alone. Though she had never once agreed to a press interview or a single media appearance, the powerful movement she had set in motion was now resonating more profoundly than any newspaper article or television segment ever could. In the days following the conference, Natalie's small, unassuming office at Empower the Future was flooded with letters and emails. They came not only from the young, aspiring entrepreneurs and members of minority communities she had always championed, but also surprisingly from those who had once been on the other side of her story, the very people whose thoughtless actions and ingrained attitudes had once wronged her so deeply. One early morning, Natalie opened her inbox and paused over an email bearing a simple, humble subject line: "A heartfelt apology from Thomas Kent." In the message, Thomas wrote thoughtfully, and with a sincerity that was impossible to fake, offering no excuses or evasions for his past behavior. Dear Ms. Coleman, it read, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I fully recognize and accept the gravity of my mistake. My attitude and my negligence back then caused you deep and unnecessary pain. I am committed to spending the rest of my life and my career actively fighting against the invisible biases that once so completely blinded me and so many others. Thank you for opening my eyes. A few days later, another carefully handwritten letter arrived at her office. This one was from Ashley, the receptionist who had initially greeted Natalie with such cold, brutal indifference. Her note was brief, but it was brimming with a raw, honest remorse. Hello, Ms. Coleman. I've thought endlessly about how I treated you. There is absolutely no justification for my behavior. I just wanted you to know that I've begun a new chapter in my life, one where I consciously remind myself every single day to treat every person I meet with kindness and with respect. I will never forget the profound lesson that you inadvertently taught me about basic human compassion and trust. Reading these words, Natalie allowed herself a quiet, relieved smile. She had never sought revenge or even a simple apology from those who had hurt her. But seeing the evidence of genuine soul-deep change in the very people who had once been so wrong filled her with a warmth and a profound sense of consolation like nothing else could. Around the same time, she learned that Stratton Financial, under Michael Andrews' direct and unwavering leadership, had fully enacted the sweeping internal reforms they had promised. The bank had now made intensive diversity awareness and anti-racism training a mandatory ongoing requirement for every single employee from the boardroom to the mailroom. Beyond Stratton, many of Raleigh's other major financial institutions and prominent local businesses began reaching out to Natalie, eager to launch their own versions of the Empower the Future program within their companies. Before long, even without a single mainstream press story, Natalie's experience spread quietly but powerfully from person to person, from one company to the next. It became a beacon, a catalyst inspiring deep, meaningful shifts in community awareness. Organizations and companies across the state began to reflect inwardly, earnestly, and uncomfortably, discussing the hidden systemic biases within their own systems issues they had for far too long conveniently ignored, whether intentionally or not. Several weeks later, on a tranquil weekend afternoon, Natalie sat alone in her modest office. She realized with a profound sense of awe that the very hardships she had been forced to endure had somehow become the greatest momentum behind real, lasting, positive change. She no longer felt the sharp sting of pain or the hot burn of anger, but instead a deep, abiding sense of peace and pride. She picked up another recent letter, this one from a young Stratton Financial employee she had never even met. Dear Ms. Coleman, though we have never met, I had to write to you and tell you how much your story and your powerful actions have completely transformed our work environment. We now serve every single client with a new awareness of their inherent value, with absolutely no room for the kind of casual discrimination we once silently accepted. My colleagues and I are sincerely grateful to you for blazing this new path of change. Natalie carefully folded the letter and gazed out the window, a feeling of deep, profound tranquility washing over her. She understood that her story had transcended its own personal boundaries. It had become a catalyst prompting people not just to change their policies, but to truly examine themselves and their community. She knew the journey had never been easy, but Natalie also recognized that she was not alone. All around her, a quiet army was forming of thousands of young people, of enlightened entrepreneurs, and of the newly awakened employees of companies both big and small, all now walking together toward a world free from the poisons of bias and discrimination. For Natalie, that was the most meaningful, most triumphant outcome of all. And in the quiet of that afternoon, she realized that the question she had once so powerfully posed at the conference had become more than just a message. It had become the strongest conviction of her life and of the lives of countless others around her. How would our world change if we trusted who someone is from the very first moment they introduced themselves? She knew that question would continue to echo, to ripple out, spurring individuals to reflect and to transform, driving a powerful, lasting turning point in the quiet, dignified fight against racism and social prejudice she had so courageously championed. If you found this story meaningful, and if you believe in the power of empathy and change, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel to continue joining us for more inspiring content just like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.